The blinding dawn of a new Russian revolution. Fascism, borderless as our lands and red as our blood. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me. This series covers important philosophers and texts in philosophy. From each I've selected an excerpt. Our target is 30 or 40 minutes, and our purpose is to do a close reading of an important work with the accompanying text. In this episode, we're turning to Alexander Dugin and his 1997 piece on Fascism, Borderless, and Red. The Soviet Union, communist for many decades, has collapsed. Russia is in transition, and Dugin is stepping forward as a national and international philosopher to call for a rejection of communism, certainly a rejection of any form of liberal capitalism, but rather for a new, resurgent Russian fascism. Let's go to the text. All right, fascism, borderless, and red. Three strong concepts there. Let's look at them initially. Fascism, hearkening back to the significant and important fascist ideologues and fascist regimes of the 20th century, actually stemming back to the 19th century. So we can compare Dugin's remarks with Mussolini, with Gentili, Rocco, and the others. Borderless, interestingly, because often we think of fascism as nationally rooted. Of course, it may very well be there, but this is going to be a fascism that is not necessarily respectful of current international borders. And then red evocative in many respects, the red of blood. Is it violent? Is it revolutionary? Is it going necessarily to involve the spilling of a significant amount of blood? And also, of course, it has ideological resonances, communism, socialism, various forms of politics on the far left. So what does Dugin mean by linking these three concepts? 1997, we're closing in at the end of the 20th century. Russia, of course, is now again Russia after a multi-decades experiment with communism that collapsed right at the end of 1991. And so for the following 5 years, Russia has been in transition, very messy what is going on, and Dugin stepping up at that point. Now, reflecting then on what has happened in the 20th century, there are, from the text, in the 20th century, only three ideologies that have managed to demonstrate that their principles are realistic in terms of their implementation. These are liberalism, communism, and fascism. So I want to say all of the other ones are going to then be impossible. What are some of these other ones? Possibly tribalism, just old-fashioned dictatorships, feudalism, anarchism, whatever they are. Dugin's estimation is 20th century history has shown those cannot be implemented realistically. Interestingly, he notices or he mentions here there are liberal countries, there are communist countries, and there are fascist. And then immediately he puts in parentheses nationalists. So in some sense there's going to be a strong link between nationalism and what he means by fascism. Perhaps liberalism is very cosmopolitan. Communism rather billed itself as an international. It's workers of the world who are supposed to unite. And so perhaps this nationalism is more central to fascism and contrasts it to both. Very interesting next sentence. In Russia, we have passed two ideological stages, the communist and the liberal. And what's interesting here is this mentioning of stages, and we do know from our reading of important modern philosophers, Hegel, Marx, and the others, that in some cases they will talk about history going through stages, sometimes necessary stages, where one stage of development sets the groundwork for the next stage, and sometimes there's a necessary development and a final end stage that history is to reach. So what do we mean? Is this more Hegelian? Is it more Marxist? Is it perhaps some other stage development philosophy? But the two stages that Russia has gone through, the claim here is the communist stage and the liberal stage. So the communism part is pretty clear from 1917 to 1991. Russian Revolution, communism took over and ran the show, or ran Russia up until its collapse in 1991 at the tail end. What does Dugin mean, though, by saying that Russia has gone through already a liberal stage? Prior to communism in 1917, Russia was largely feudal. It was trying to modernize in some respects, but it had the czars, and so it wasn't very clear that that could be the liberal stage that he's talking about. And the order seems to indicate that perhaps he means the period from 1992 until 1997, that 5 or 6 years or so. That's the liberal stage, and we've gone through that already. And so what remains as he closes this paragraph out is for fascism. Fascism is going to be the next stage. Now, what do we mean by fascism? And he goes on to clarify here that it's not going to be what he now calls national capitalism. We've already seen that there's a linking between fascism and nationalism, but it's going to then be any sort of connection to capitalism that has to be rejected. So perhaps the nationalism part is fine, but the capitalist linkages are suspect here. So text, one of the versions of fascism which it seems Russian society is today ready or almost ready to embrace is national capitalism. And so the nation is first, but then within that context, there are some capitalistic elements that are encouraged, allowed to flourish, and so on. Yet, and now we put these in quotation marks, indicating some skepticism or distancing from them, national capitalist, or this right-wing variation of fascism, does by no means exhaust the nature of this ideology. And then a few sentences later, actually one sentence later, he goes on more strongly to say, in fact, that is entirely alien to fascism as a worldview, as a doctrine, as a style. So the attempt to integrate nationalism and capitalism, he wants to argue, is completely impossible. And then he goes on to say that that way of trying to conceptualize the landscape comes out of Marxism, and we need to reject that Marxism. This is a Marxist definition of the phenomenon of capitalism. It does not, and so what's problematic about this Marxist definition? It does absolutely not take into account the specific philosophical self-reflection of fascist ideology, and consciously ignores the fundamental core pathos of fascism. So there's a core fascist ideology, a set of ideas and principles, and a pathos, kind of a feeling that animates it. It's not necessarily intellectualized, but nonetheless is animating the passions, the feelings, the drives of those who are fascist. All right, so what's the problem then with capitalist connections to fascism? Fascism, this is nationalism, and not yet any nationalism, but a revolutionary, rebellious, romantic, idealistic form of nationalism. So let's look at each of those terms. It's revolutionary, that is to say, we need to take the existing system and turn it completely upside down, or reject all of it at its fundamentals. Rebellious, that is to say, whatever the existing system is, we are against it, and we don't just argue merely against it, but we take action steps against it. That it's romantic, it's a great cause, it's a great adventure. We're setting ourselves up for goals that we are willing to put ourselves out there for. And it is idealistic. It's not just grubby, amoral business as usual. Instead, we have high ideals that we are striving for. It is an impossible dream, right? Whatever the impossible dream is. Now, this is interesting. It is a dream, so it's a kind of vision that is operating. He describes it here as impossible, but we perhaps need to take that with a grain of salt, because he has in the first paragraph said we have to start with a realistic assessment of what in fact is possible. So perhaps there's a little bit of rhetorical flourish rather than literalness. But what we are striving for is to give birth to a society of the hero and the superhero. human. So we need, in some sense, to evolve or by means of a revolution, go beyond the current state of human development and human society to some sort of superior, further sense. And here this is Dugin hearkening back and echoing that Hegelian, perhaps Marxist, and perhaps now Nietzschean call for a transcendence of current human realities. Now, let's get down then to specifics. On the economic level, so if we look only at economics, fascism is characterized rather by socialist or moderately socialist methods. So we can't try to, if we're going to be genuine fascists, he's arguing, compromise or try to integrate capitalist themes. It has to be socialist economically, which subordinate personal, individual economic interests to the principles of national welfare. So there's a kind of national collectivity, taking society as a whole, as the unit, and any sort of individual, personal, self-interested thing is definitely subordinated to those national socialist economic interests. And then finally, the fascist view of culture corresponds to a radical rejection of the humanistic, excessively humane mentality. That is to say, we're not trying to be nice here, or in some sense to say all human beings are of equal worth and have equal dignity in some sort of universalism in that liberal humanistic sense. There's going to be a rough, harsh edge to the fascism, and that's going to clearly set it up against any sort of liberal capitalism and let's trade with each other and have international peace. So we have three then elements. It's a romantic idealism, it's an economic socialism, and it is anti-humanistic in that nice liberal sense. Further, the fascist hates the intellectual as a type. It's not just, particular intellectuals with whom they disagree, but there's something wrong with the intellectual as a type. That is to say, too much thinking, too much abstractly building systems and so forth. That is not the type of person that we are interested in or trying to create. By contrast, the fascist loves the brutal, superhuman, and angel-like at the same time. An interesting combination of features he's trying to capture here. With other words, the fascism despises everything that makes up the essence of national capitalism. He fights for the domination of national idealism. So the nationalism part is fine, but it is capitalism versus idealism. Capitalism is not at all idealistic. Instead, we need to reject whatever capitalism stands for and replace it with a kind of ideal. Now, interestingly, we then go on and start to name specific fascist progenitors and fascist nations, and Dugin singles them out for praise, even though he's going to criticize some of the implementations that they engaged in. The first person mentioned by name here, the fascist pathos, is accurately defined in the famous phrase of Mussolini. And we have a separate Philosophers Explained episode on Mussolini's doctrine of fascism, co-written with the philosopher Gentili. But here's the quotation. Rise, fascist and proletarian Italy. All right, so perhaps the substitution of nations is what we need to do. Rise, fascist and proletarian Russia. So fascist and proletarian, such is the orientation of fascism. And then this emphasis on the proletarian, members of society, right? The workers, people in the fields, people in the factories, not the office working capitalists and city traders and so forth. So this is a commonality then, going back, of course, to Marx and Engels and various forms of left socialism. And then, of course, that was taken up by the fascists and some of the national socialists in Germany, the proletarian emperor. It is labor and heroic. It does not have anything in common with securing additional government comfort for the traders. So we're not trying to organize the economy in a way that's going to help traders get rich and so forth, or for the sinecures, for the socially parasitic intelligentsia. So the trading capitalists and the intelligentsia, so that is to say the free market types and the intellectuals, those are both alien, and fascism wants very little, if not nothing, to do with any of them. On the top, of course, we have the broad mass of the proletariat, the people who work for the good of the society. On the top, though, right, is the supreme symbol of the tragic fight with destiny. Cosmic entropy is the god-like leader. And here again, we can think of Hegel with his world historical individuals, Marx with his vanguard of the proletariat, and perhaps a suggestion now here even of Nietzsche with his superhuman types, or his overman, the Zarathustra types who are going to come along. Duce, to use the Italian word, Führer, to use the German word. So hearkening back explicitly to Italian fascism, German National Socialism, superhuman, who realizes his super individual personality, in his super individual personality, the extraordinary tension of the national will for feet. So it is going to be in this special supreme individual that the nation is embodied, and he is going to be the leader, the one with the power to make it happen. And of course, it was not that we're going to entirely eliminate the merchants, entirely eliminate the university professors, but they are, as Dugin suggests here, going to be at the periphery and very secondary, tertiary roles in society. Now, then, having mentioned some historical antecedents, he wants to then say something about the historical practice, because the fascist regimes were defeated and lost out in the course of 20th century history. So what is the lesson of history for this generation of fascists to learn? In history, clean, ideal fascism did not experience a direct incarnation. And then he goes on to mention Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Franco in Spain, as well as Salazar in Portugal. And so here are four fascists, right, who tried, but they failed. And why did they fail? They failed because they compromised. They compromised with some conservatives. They compromised with some nationalistic capitalists. They compromised with some people who were in charge of large corporations. Yet this compromise always ended deplorable for the fascist regimes. You can't compromise, Dugin is saying. It has to be pure fascist principles all the way through, resist the temptation to take fascism in a more right capitalistic kind of direction. And he puts the language then even more strongly here. If you go down that road, then you're going to be selling out to the liberal capitalists in England and the United States, and no compromise is possible. Strong language. National capitalism is the inner virus of fascism, its enemy and guarantor of its degeneration and perishing. National capitalism is in no way an essential characteristic of fascism. On the contrary, as an accidental and contradictory element in its inner structure. So, as an ideological matter, as a matter of principle, fascism, he's arguing, and capitalism are opposite to each other. But even as a matter of practical necessity, any attempt of mixing and matching on pragmatic grounds, he argues, is going to work to the detriment of fascism, and the lessons of 20th century history, he thinks, then shows the failure of that. So, therefore, in our case, in the case of growing Russian national capitalism, and perhaps that is what is going on in Russia in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it is a kind of nationalism. It still has strong authoritarian elements, and people are genuinely thinking of themselves as Russian nationalists, but they are incorporating some elements of Western capitalism and so forth, and that's the virus. Instead, one cannot speak about fascism but of an attempt to preliminary pervert it. national capitalists and the people who are rising to the top in late 1990s Russia. These are just former Communist Party leaders who are used to boss around and humiliate the people. So they had communist authoritarianism. What you would then have is people who have very smoothly come up with a new kind of authoritarianism. It's the same sort of corruption now with just some capitalist dressing instead of the former communist dressing. And so these liberal Democrats are perhaps insincere, but in either case, they are perverting what Dugin wants to be the pure fascist alternative. So a little bit more about what this fascism is going to be. It's going to be revolutionary. It's going to be romantic. It has to be idealistic. It has to be brutal. The nature of fascism is a new hierarchy, a new aristocracy. But this is not going to just be based on accidents of family birth, as in old-fashioned aristocracies. Hierarchy is going to be based on natural, organic, and clear principles, dignity, honor, courage, and heroism. So he's putting forth not just prowess on the battlefield or I was born into the right family, but rather certain ideals, moral ideals, virtues of character that need to be exhibited by those who are going to be the aristocrats of the fascist regime. And he contrasts these new kinds of aristocrats with those who might get to the top by various other ways based on their, quote, conformist abilities, their flexibility, caution, taste for intrigues, toadyism, and so on. So people who can sneakily work the system and survive in the system versus those who have what Dugin takes to be fascist virtues and deservedly can assume power. The obvious conflict between two styles, two human types, two normative systems is inescapable. And so this strikes me as a very clear reference to Nietzsche with his two types, the master types and the slave types, and the two very different kinds of moralities or two different kinds of normative systems. We know that Dugin has read his Nietzsche and is taking from Nietzsche some and adapting it to his own. And of course, Nietzsche called for a new kind of aristocracy as well. And we also have an episode on Nietzsche exactly on this topic in our Philosophers Explained series. So if we're rejecting national capitalism, what are we trying to replace it then with? In the next section, we turn to Russian socialism. So it's going to be the Russian nation. And so the nationalism part, we will maintain that, but it will be with socialism. So it's absolutely unjustified to call fascism an extremely right-wing ideology. If it is socialistic, then it has to be of the left. It is a combination of perhaps right-wing cultural political orientation, traditionalism, faithfulness to the soil, roots, national ethics, with a left-wing economic program. Social justice, limitation to the market forces, deliverance from credit slavery, the prohibition of stock market speculation, monopolies, trusts, and the primacy of honest work. So if we think of a traditional conservatism with its rooted in the culture, rooted in the land, rooted in family traditions, that on the right, yes, fascism is going to take that. But if we take all of the anti-capitalist socialist economic policies and put those two together, then we get fascism in Dugin's vision. And the question then again can be how close this is to Mussolini's fascism, to Goebbels and Hitler's fascism or National Socialism, and the parallels are striking. As he goes on to say here, in analogy to National Socialism, which was often simply called German socialism, one can speak of Russian fascism as Russian socialism. So in both cases, the left-wing socialistic economic policy cast in terms of nationalistic traditions and roots. The ethnic specification of the term socialism has, in this context, a specific meaning. So that perhaps the taxonomy is going to be that there is socialism, which is more broadly, but the Marxist version of socialism wants to be internationalistic, workers of the world, whereas the fascist versions of socialism are going to be nationalistic socialisms. There will be different socialisms, or at least with different flavors, depending on each nation's unique ethnic and cultural histories. And then he goes on to elaborate, or says that exactly. On the basis of concrete, spiritual, ethical, and cultural principles that have organically formed the nation as such. And then, of course, the concretes vary from nation to nation, so while generically they will all be socialist, they will be nonetheless deeply informed by their particular national uniqueness. Russian socialism. That is not Russians for socialism, but socialism for the Russians. Interesting verse. So it's not there's a generic socialism and we try to squeeze the Russians into it. Rather, we take the Russians as they are with their culture and tradition and adapt socialism for that particular national ethnic group. And then in the case of the Russians, such a socialism, excuse me, will be more rural than proletarian, more communal and cooperative than administrative, more regionalistic than centralistic. And so we can say there was the Marxist version of socialism that emphasized heavy industry and the urban proletarian. It was heavily bureaucratic and administrative and much more characterized by centralized planning and top-down authority. Instead, this version of socialism is going to be more rurally based, more communal, and more regionalistic. Now, how are we going to get there? Well, what do we do with the existing crop of Russian people? And in some sense, we have to work with them, but in some sense, we do need to have a new kind of Russian. So let's new people. Such a Russian revolution should be built by new people, a new type of people, a new class, a class of heroes and revolutionaries. The Russians are longing for freshness, for modernity, for unfeigned romanticism, for living participation in some great cause. Right? So that's the idealism and the romanticism again. And it's also not that we are just going back to some kind of old, dusty, feudal, pre-modern times. We want to take whatever the best can be from modernism that is going to work with Russian socialism, fascism, and craft a new kind of Russian identity, or an evolved or revolved kind of Russian identity on the basis of that. And so this is the project then of the young, not already those who are old, tired, and already corrupted by the previous stages that Russia has gone through. So the national revolutionaries is a call to the young. They will be young, malicious, merry, fearless, passionate, and not knowing limits. They will build and destroy, rule and fulfill orders, conduct purges of the enemies of the nation, and tenderly take care of Russian elderly and children. Yes, they deeply thirst for power, and they will shove the people into the sweet process of creating history. So we need a new, brutal, power-lusting, power-enjoying class of revolutionaries who will have no fear, and they will passionately take Russia where it needs to go into the next stage. And of course, we'll just have to purge anybody who does not fit with the program. It's interesting that the word history is created here, or capitalized rather, history with a capital H. That is a kind of a slightly term of art coming out of Hegelian understanding of history, the Marxist understanding of history. There is an agenda, there is a purpose, there is a telos, or an end for history to reach, and we seem to have an echo here that Putin is in that stage as well. All right, he then quotes another fascist writer approvingly, Brasilach, of prophecy. I see how in the East, right, referring to Russia perhaps directly, in Russia, and actually directly Russia, fascism is rising, a fascism borderless and red. Dugin loves that quotation, hence the title of this piece. And in some sense, Russia is the prophetic nation. Hegel had thought perhaps it was going to be German. Marx was not clear. He had his hopes set on various nations around the world, but he did seem to think that the most advanced capitalist nations would be the ones first to get to communism. And now here we have Dugin proposing Russia is the world historical destiny nation for the world first to experience pure fascism. And then it's not going to be this compromised, brownish, pinkish national capitalism, but the blinding dawn of a new Russian revolution. It has to be a revolution. Fascism, borderless as our lands and red as our blood. Now again, we can see that both aspects of the red are relevant here. It is going to be a bloody revolution, right, with no limits and purges, but at the same time hearkening back to the use of red symbolically in socialist iconography. And then the borderless part is interesting because while we have an emphasis in Dugin on the nation, we do not get any indication here that it's going to be confined to the nation, that once Russia gets its act together and becomes fascist in the proper sense, it will of course be rooted in the Russian nation, but that does not necessarily mean that any of the existing national borders are to be respected or are in any way sacrosanct. Russia can expand as much as it has the energy and the will to do.